SK, a $250 million battery production in Kentucky, SK Battery America in Georgia, the Hyundai LG plant in Georgia as well. And in the Inflation Reduction Act, we incentivize new and used EVs and domestic battery manufacturing. And we finally saw domestic battery manufacturing growing.
Just second-life battery material installation in the world. But EPA's framework creates uncertainty about these batteries, whether they're waste when they first leave a vehicle, hindering the entire repurposing industry when demand from data centers and AI is surging. Our ask is
최근 미국 의회에서 배터리 핵심 소재 공급망을 어떻게 세울 것인지에 대해 아주 진지한 논의가 오갔습니다. 강대국 미국조차 중국의 소재를 의존하며 느끼는 불안함이 컸는데요. 이 문제를 해결하려는 과정에서 대한민국의 배터리 제조 기술과 소재 관리 능력이 중요한 화두로 다뤄지고 있습니다.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for today's very important hearing about how U.S. environmental laws impact critical mineral supply chains, our national security, and economic growth. Our country has a rich bounty of natural resources, and for most of the 20th century, the United States was the leader in producing and refining critical minerals. However, the past several decades, China has aggressively sought to dominate the global market for critical minerals, with dire consequences for our national security. China is now responsible for almost exclusively producing about 24 critical minerals that our national security and defense depend on. And most of the so-called black mass that is recovered from lithium-ion batteries is shipped back to China for recycling. Today, April 22nd, is recognized as Earth Day. It is fitting that we are discussing how the move of critical supply chains to China has coincided with the enactment of multiple environmental laws in the U.S., where we have seen improvements in our environment, but at what cost to our manufacturing economy and national security? President Trump has issued several executive orders to focus the federal government's attention on these risks and to have all departments and agencies working together to reshore the domestic critical mineral mining and processing supply chains. My bill, H.R. 4370, the Securing America's Mineral Supply Act, would codify these policies to support domestic critical minerals mining and processing. As we on the Energy and Commerce Committee consider legislative reforms to the Toxic Substance Control Act, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, and other environmental laws, we should work together to find solutions that support the reshoring of the entire critical mineral supply chain. It will make little sense for us to support increased critical mineral mining in the U.S. if we are not also supporting the other parts of the supply chain, from the manufacture of the chemicals and energy needed to process critical minerals to the facilities needed to recover and recycle these valuable commodities on the back end. Given our broad jurisdiction, the Energy and Commerce Committee is well positioned to advance common sense legislative reforms to ensure that the United States has the tools it needs to both produce and process critical minerals in this country. We have an excellent panel with us today to discuss the challenges in securing domestic supply chains.
미국은 한때 소재 강국이었지만 지금은 꼭 필요한 핵심 소재 상당 부분을 중국에 기대고 있습니다. 배터리 재활용 소재까지 다시 중국으로 보내는 상황이라 안보 위기를 느끼고 있는데요. 미국은 이제 내부적으로 소재를 직접 캐고 가공하려 합니다. 이때 소재를 다루는 정밀한 공정 능력을 갖춘 대한민국 배터리 산업의 저력이 미국에게는 유용한 참고 사례가 됩니다.
Unfortunately, over the past 16 months, we have witnessed congressional Republicans and the Trump administration repeal major incentives and regulations that were already working to induce demand for domestic critical materials. That includes the Republicans' repeal of the 30D Clean Vehicle Tax Credit, which derived up to 1/2 of its value from a vehicle's use of an American-made battery with compliant mineral components. Additionally, the Trump administration has terminated hundreds of millions of dollars in grants to domestic battery manufacturers. The uncertainty that has been created by these decisions has resulted in the cancellation of tens of billions of dollars of private sector investments intended to build a domestic clean energy industry to compete with China. These ideologically driven actions are making our supply chain vulnerabilities worse, plain and simple. Instead, we will still consider this majority's preferred solution to every industrial challenge, repealing our nation's environmental and public health laws. It is tiresome. It is not getting us any closer to enacting meaningful or durable federal policy. So instead, I would recommend that we have a conversation about how federal laws can play a constructive role in achieving our shared goals. In my view, that could start with a national extended producer responsibility program for lithium-ion batteries and e-waste. Every expert agrees that recycling can address a significant part of our needs. Once we have gone through the troublesome efforts of importing critical materials by imposing collection, reuse, and recycling requirements, we can ensure that those materials stay here in the United States and displace the need for additional imports in the future.
최근 미국 내에서 지원금이 줄어들며 민간 투자가 위축되는 모습이 보입니다. 전문가들은 소재를 들여온 뒤 다시 수거해 쓰는 생산자 책임제를 통해 자원이 밖으로 나가는 것을 막아야 한다고 말합니다. 이는 효율적인 회수 체계와 소재 가공 능력을 확보한 우리 한국 기업들이 이미 현장에서 경험하고 있는 실무 영역이기도 합니다.
Republicans continue to talk about the very threat from China, but their policies are misaligned. The rest of the world, particularly China, is investing in the clean energy economy, more so now after Trump's war in Iran. China has created a vertically integrated model centered on supply and demand for clean energy technologies like solar and batteries, giving them a stranglehold over the world's downstream, midstream, and upstream supply chain for critical materials. If we want to get serious about combating China's dominance over the critical material supply chain, Republicans and the Trump administrations need to stop their assault on homegrown clean energy. Their clean energy rollbacks undermine our efforts to lead the global clean energy transition, leaving the world to rely on China for critical minerals, and exposing us to geopolitical supply chain risks. To change this dynamic, we need a strong domestic market for clean energy technologies so that companies are willing to make long-term investments in this sector. Instead of scapegoating environmental laws, Congress must build on democratic investments to create a domestic market for critical minerals, bolster domestic supply chains, create jobs, and fuel a clean energy economy. We must also strengthen our domestic capabilities to reduce our reliance on foreign sources. We must grow and cement our relationships with our friends and allies abroad to develop and access new critical mineral supply chains, also known as friendshoring. The United States must invest in the processing of critical materials and battery recycling to increase the domestic supply of these resources, and we must rely on and invest in American ingenuity in creating innovative solutions that reduce the need for extraction, like innovative battery chemistry.
중국은 소재부터 완제품까지 모든 단계를 꽉 쥐고 시장을 주도하고 있습니다. 이에 맞서려면 미국 내부 기술 시장을 키우는 동시에 믿을 수 있는 우방국과 협력하는 프렌드 쇼어링이 필요합니다. 배터리 소재와 제조 분야에서 꾸준히 경쟁력을 쌓아온 대한민국은 미국이 공급망 위기를 함께 풀어나가야 할 주요한 협력 대상입니다.
The scale of dependence is significant. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, the U.S. relies on imports for over half of its supply of more than 40 critical minerals and is fully import dependent for at least a dozen. Inputs like copper, rare earth elements, and specialty metals are essential across everything from data centers to grid systems to consumer technologies. At the same time, global markets for these materials are often characterized by concentrated production, limited transparency, and periods of significant price volatility. In industries where projects require billions of dollars and years to develop, that volatility has real consequences. When future pricing and supply conditions are difficult to model, the cost of capital raises, investment slows, and production capacity does not get built. Second, strengthening these supply chains requires a coordinated, system-wide approach, not isolated policy actions. The core challenge is not simply resource availability. It is whether the U.S. can create the conditions under which capital will be committed to building industrial capacity across the value chain and at scale. That depends on alignment across several interconnected factors: regulatory clarity and permitting timelines, aligning policy tools to support long-term investment, access to long-duration patient capital, coordination across supply chain segments, and consistency in environmental and operating standards. When these elements work together, investment becomes viable, timelines compress, and capacity grows. When they are misaligned, projects stall, even when demand is strong and technology is proven. Third, regulatory clarity and consistent environmental standards are central to enabling that system and to attracting long-term investment. The United States should maintain strong environmental protections. That is essential for public trust and long-term sustainability. But from the perspective of developers and investors, the defining issue is predictability. Today, regulatory processes are often fragmented across agencies, timelines are uncertain, and outcomes can vary. When regulatory pathways are clear and consistently applied, investors are willing to commit long-duration capital. When they are not, projects are delayed or do not move forward at all. At the same time, consistent environmental and labor standards, both domestically and across allied supply chains, ensure that growth does not come at the expense of responsible production.
미국은 40종이 넘는 핵심 소재의 절반 이상을 수입하고 있으며 일부는 전적으로 의존하는 심각한 상태입니다. 이를 해결하려면 자원 확보뿐 아니라 정책이 일관되게 유지되어야 합니다. 안정적인 공급망을 운영해본 경험이 많은 대한민국 배터리 산업의 관리 방식은 미국이 겪는 혼란을 줄이는 데 도움이 될 수 있습니다.
Chairman Palmer, Ranking Member Tonko, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Bea Spiller. I'm a fellow and transportation program director at Resources for the Future. The views I'm expressing today are my own. Building a domestic critical mineral supply chain is challenging, and the difficulty is not explained by any single factor. In my remarks today, I'll cover 4 key barriers to scaling domestic supply, address why weakening environmental safeguards won't solve them, and discuss 4 policy options that can support the domestic industry while still protecting communities. So let's talk about the barriers to building a domestic critical mineral supply chain. First, it's more expensive to extract and process minerals in the United States than in other regions, in part because key inputs like labor, electricity, and construction materials cost more here. And while environmental regulations can raise costs, they're generally not the primary cost driver. Second, domestic producers face global prices that are often low and frequently volatile. This creates an investment risk that domestic producers cannot control. And importantly, low prices are often artificially low because they reflect unpriced environmental and labor harms of production. When those harms are not internalized, the global price signal undercuts firms that are trying to operate responsibly. Third, permitting times are long. But the evidence suggests that eliminating community engagement to speed up timelines is not a shortcut. In fact, reduced engagement can increase the likelihood of litigation after permits are issued, potentially lengthening timelines rather than shortening them. And fourth, we have a workforce and know-how challenge. After decades of limited domestic activity, we have gaps in trained labor and institutional expertise. Capacity constraints show up in industry, and recent staffing shortages in federal agencies reduce the government's ability to support mapping, permitting, regulatory review, and innovation. Given these barriers, weakening environmental protections will not create a viable domestic supply chain. The binding constraints are larger and more structural, and these include cost differentials, price volatility, missing skills and capacity, and long development timelines. But beyond that, environmental safeguards are part of the competitive advantage of producing here, in that they help ensure that the supply chain is sustainable and socially legitimate. And well-designed environmental rules can encourage innovation, including process improvements that can reduce emissions and sometimes even reduce costs. Strong standards can support workforce recruitment and retention because people are more likely to live and work where air and water are clean and safety risks are managed.
미국 땅에서 광물을 캐고 가공하려면 비용이 많이 들고 숙련된 인력도 부족합니다. 환경 규제를 푼다고 금방 해결될 일이 아니라 실제 현장에서 일할 수 있는 지식이 필요하다는 지적입니다. 수십 년간 배터리 소재 분야에서 끈질기게 실력을 닦아온 대한민국 전문가들의 현장 노하우가 미국의 인력 공백을 메울 수 있는 현실적인 방법이 됩니다.
The title of this hearing asks whether our environmental laws help or hinder critical mineral supply chains. These laws were written for a different era, before the lithium-ion battery industry existed. Applied to today's materials and processes, they are producing outcomes that no one intended, pushing investment, manufacturing, and critical mineral recovery offshore rather than keeping them within our borders. 2 EPA legal frameworks are at the center of this problem, RCRA and TSCA. Both need to be modernized to reflect current technology and market realities and to align with the goals this committee and the administration are pursuing. Under RCRA, EPA classifies used lithium-ion batteries as hazardous waste. That classification forces domestic recyclers into a permitting process that can take years to complete. It's a death knell for innovation. Or it requires us to store batteries at a physically separate location from where we process. Batteries must be unloaded and reloaded and trucked on a public road from one property to the next. This creates more risk, not less. China reclassified these same materials as non-waste raw material last year and now controls more than 80% of global lithium-ion recycling capacity. The EU went the other direction, classified black mass as hazardous waste, and is already seeing investor flight and canceled projects. The United States is on track to make the same mistake. Under TSCA, the EPA treats each modified cathode material as an entirely new chemical substance, triggering a review process that's supposed to take 90 days, but in practice takes over a year. It's followed by a second rulemaking that adds months or years more. Total time to market regularly exceeds 3 years. The message to manufacturers is simple: build overseas and import the finished product. TSCA also punishes recyclers. Restrictions imposed by EPA under TSCA prevent new variants of battery materials from domestic distribution. Consequently, a domestic recycler cannot distribute the material it recovers within the United States. As a result, critical minerals are exported. That is the exact opposite of what this committee is trying to achieve. These batteries also impact energy storage. Many end-of-life EV batteries retain up to 80% of their usable capacity. Through Redwood Energy, we've deployed the largest second-life battery material installation in the world. But EPA's framework creates uncertainty about these batteries, whether they're waste when they first leave a vehicle, hindering the entire repurposing industry when demand from data centers and AI is surging. Our ask is straightforward. First, enact a National Lithium-Ion Battery Management Act that creates a unified federal framework. Second, use EPA rulemaking to exclude lithium-ion batteries and battery materials destined for repurposing or recycling from the definition of solid waste. Third, reform TSCA's treatment of cathode materials so domestic manufacturers and recyclers are not penalized for operating in the U.S. And fourth, mandate interagency alignment so EPA works towards the same goals as other agencies in this committee. The materials are in the U.S., the technology is in the U.S., the investment is ready. What we need is a regulatory framework that prioritizes these critical materials for what they are, strategic assets. Thank you. I welcome your question.
이제는 배터리 재활용을 가로막는 낡은 법들을 현실에 맞게 고쳐야 한다는 목소리가 높습니다. 배터리를 폐기물로 보면 절차가 너무 복잡해져서 투자가 꺼려지기 때문인데요. 배터리를 전략 자산으로 관리하는 새로운 기준이 필요한 시점이며 여기서 재활용 기술력을 가진 우리 한국 기업들의 역할이 함께 거론됩니다. 보시죠.
We're in a position to keep them.
Absolutely.
And that is through the battery recycling efforts. In the bipartisan infrastructure law, there was about $6 billion in battery manufacturing, recycling, and processing. Trump has targeted these efforts, canceling $700 million in grants, including support for a $1 billion recycling battery facility in Kentucky. Dr. Spiller, can you speak to the importance of certainty and what this does when these dollars get pulled out of the market?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Market certainty is really important. Projects are really expensive and they take years to build. And there's 3 specific aspects of certainty that we have to think about. And the first one is regulatory and policy certainty, right? And thinking that the policies are going to maintain fixed and not flip-flop over time, as we saw. The second one is demand certainty, and this has a lot to do with policies, right? Policies drive demand. So understanding whether or not the demand for the products are going to grow over time. And then finally, price certainty. So being able to know whether or not, are you going to have a price of minerals that is going to, not be subject to massive price volatility. And so this is where off-take agreements is so hugely important.
재활용 시설에 대한 투자가 계속되려면 정책과 수요, 그리고 가격이 예측 가능해야 합니다. 그래야 기업들이 안심하고 장기 투자를 결정할 수 있습니다. 대한민국은 배터리 소재의 장기 구매 계약과 효율적인 공급망 관리를 통해 이런 불확실성을 이겨낸 사례가 많으며 이는 미국이 참고할 만한 경험입니다.
Need urgent action to address Chinese dominance in the critical minerals sector. And as we build out domestic critical mineral capacity, it is vital that the U.S. pursue alternatives that reduce our dependence on China. Collaborating with our allies is a faster, more efficient, and more cost-effective way to secure critical minerals than expanding domestic industry alone. Dr. Spiller, how will shifting our supply chains away from our adversaries and to our partners diminish China's market dominance?
Thanks for that question. I mean, quite frankly, we're going to need to friendshore and work with our allies to chip away at China's market dominance. Right? Given the major challenges that we've been discussing today and that I presented in my testimony, the U.S. isn't going to be able to do this alone, and particularly not in the time frame that the federal government is hoping to be able to, achieve market independence or get away from China's market dominance. So we're going to need to ally with as many countries as possible and leverage our comparative advantages all along the supply chain.
Right, and the Trump administration has said repeatedly that America first does not mean America alone. We need to engage with our allies. And Dr. Spiller, how can cooperation with those allies help reduce the need for domestic extraction and processing?
Well, we can rely upon other countries that have maybe already started
미국 혼자만의 힘으로는 중국의 장악력을 낮추는데 한계가 명확합니다. 우방국들이 각자의 강점을 합쳐 효율적인 생산망을 새로 짜야 한다는 증언입니다. 특히 소재 가공과 배터리 제조 능력을 갖춘 대한민국의 실력은 미국이 중국 의존도를 낮추기 위해 협력해야 할 핵심적인 역량 중 하나입니다.
And in the Inflation Reduction Act, we incentivize new and used EVs and domestic battery manufacturing. And we finally saw domestic battery manufacturing growing again. That was before Trump's war on clean energy. Since then, the president canceled $700 million in battery manufacturing, incentives that were already awarded. Under the Big Ugly Law, it eliminated the EV tax credits and the battery manufacturing tax credits as well. And since Liberation Day, we've seen literally almost 2 years in a row of declining U.S. manufacturing. So it's rich that a lot of my colleagues who literally voted to destroy the manufacturing incentives for batteries are now going to blame environmental laws. And then on top of it, the president demanding government ownership shares of private companies. That is literally the socialism people are warning about. Add in the tariffs and the Iran war, and it's not the environmental laws that are a threat to our supply chain. It's the president's disastrous policies. And then we see a current trend that's really disturbing. We only have one U.S. rare earth element mine in the country, Mountain Pass, Mojave Desert, which had some shutdowns already. We've seen closed mines in the Jervois cobalt mine in Idaho, U.S. magnesium in Utah, magnitude 7 metals in Missouri.
한때 지원금 정책으로 배터리 제조가 살아나는 듯했지만 정책이 바뀌며 다시 후퇴하는 모순이 생겼습니다. 환경법 탓을 하기보다 실패한 정책을 먼저 돌아봐야 한다는 비판이 나옵니다. 이런 혼란 속에서도 결국 시장은 제대로 된 제품을 만드는 능력을 찾게 되며 그 과정에서 대한민국의 배터리 기술이 계속 주목받고 있습니다.
We are recycling spent refinery catalysts to recover vanadium as opposed to people having to go mine that out of the earth.
Okay,
So-
well, thank you for your opinion on that. Next, we see a bunch of battery plants closed over the last year or two. Fortescue canceled a $210 million EV battery factory in Detroit. Blue Oval, SK, a $250 million battery production in Kentucky. SK Battery America in Georgia, the Hyundai LG plant in Georgia as well. Ms. Spiller, why are the battery plants also closing?
Well, battery plants are closing mainly because demand for electric vehicles are crashing. And I would argue that a big reason why demand for electric vehicles are crashing are because the policies at the federal level have reversed. And all of the policies that the Biden administration had put in place supporting electric vehicle demand have now been, removed by the Trump administration.
It's at a tough time, too, because about 20% of new vehicles last year in Florida were either electric or hybrid. So we're seeing demand go up, and that's actually still kind of steady even after the IRA's gone, but we're losing the manufacturing to help produce these vehicles.
실제로 블루오발 SK 배터리 아메리카, 그리고 현대차와 LG의 공장들이 직접 언급됩니다. 최근 전기차 수요가 줄며 일부 공장의 생산을 줄이는 어려운 상황이 생겼지만 이는 역설적으로 미국이 우리 기업들의 제조 능력에 얼마나 크게 기대고 있었는지를 보여줍니다. 대한민국의 정교한 공정 능력이 미국 산업 현장에서 얼마나 중요한 비중을 차지하는지 알 수 있는 장면입니다. 강대국 미국이 겪고 있는 공급망의 진통을 보며 우리는 우리 한국인들이 가진 실력과 끈기가 얼마나 큰 가치가 있는지 다시금 느끼게 됩니다. 남의 도움 없이 스스로 일궈낸 이 기술력이 이제는 미국이 필요로 하는 중요한 자산이 되어 존중을 이끌어내고 있습니다. 우리 안에 흐르는 이 자랑스러운 저력이 앞으로의 미래를 어떻게 더 빛나게 만들지 함께 지켜봐 주시면 좋겠습니다. 오늘 영상을 보며 시청자 여러분들은 어떤 생각이 드셨나요? 오늘 영상은 여기까지입니다. 시청해 주셔서 감사합니다.